One of the great perks of what I do is being able to shoot with all the different gear from all the different brands. And after borrowing this Canon R5 for a month, while I'm not about to switch from Nikon, it makes me sadder than most to send back. So I'll share my thoughts on it. Well, welcome everyone, Hudson here. Before I jump in and start talking about this camera, I want to give a few little announcements and caveats. Maybe the caveats first. I know a lot of you who follow this channel regularly are big time Nikon shooters. I'm not about to switch, as I said in the intro. I have, decades of muscle memory and aficionado status with Nikon. And I have a huge investment in glass and camera bodies, and I love the system. I absolutely love shooting with my Zs. This is not a camera I like better than my Zs. It's just a camera that I think is really, really well done. And I have to say, to Canon shooters that have been holding out for the right mirrorless to switch to, this camera is amazing and well worth considering making that switch. So, if you're a DSLR Canon shooter, you're gonna love this camera. So we'll talk about it a little bit. Second caveat is that I really don't think gear is going to improve your photography. Despite as much as we talk about gear in this channel in so many different places and workshops and just photographers as a group, we tend to obsess about gear. The real thing that's going to make you a better photographer is practicing that seeing muscle, learning to see photographically, thinking photographically even when you don't have a camera in your hand, looking through works of other photographers that you really admire and thinking about what they did and what they were seeing and how they captured that image. I think that workshops or camera clubs or getting together in groups and sharing your photography is a great way to advance really rapidly. And on that note, I want to make sure that I put out an announcement for the office hours. It's a big photographic group meeting that we do usually every few weeks. We're going to have one on the 24th of this month, August. It's right before we're doing our first workshop since in the last year and a half since the whole world got disrupted. And I can't wait to get back out with a group of photographers on the Oregon coast. I have a great group. So we're going to talk about workshops, we're going to talk about shared experiences, questions, trepidations, whatever you might wonder about. It's a meeting about all things photographic. Any questions are welcome. You can submit a question when you sign up at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. But the general topic is going to be workshops. We'll talk about how we're going to be keeping ourselves safe in this particular age as we get together in a group. We're talking about some of the plans for the next couple of years and take your questions and experiences. So submit those when you sign up. There's a form for it at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. You can join on YouTube Live, or we can all get together and see each other's faces on Zoom. That you can choose your platform. Okay, enough on that. Let's talk a little bit about this camera and what I really love about it. One more thing. Quick shout out to B&H for the loan of this. I was really curious about it. They were kind enough to send me this R5 body along with the new 70-200 f4 for the RF mount, which is a stellar lens. I'll show you some images as we go through and talk about this camera that lets you get a feel for what this f4 is capable of. It zooms out, zooms back, makes it nice and compact. When you don't have the hood on it, it can lock so it can't zoom out while it's in your bag. The camera is just really solidly built. It has some wonderful features. I think one thing I just absolutely adore about it is the flippy screen. I wish all the brands were following Panasonic's suit and giving us this kind of articulating screen. It swings out. You can protect it by putting it against the camera. You can flip it around and put it against the camera and have a traditional LCD style screen like you'd be used to on your DSLR. This makes it so easy to film yourself for someone like me and see what's going on while you're filming yourself. To shoot an image while you're way up above the camera without getting down on the ground, because you can just rotate it and see, or at any angle that you're working, you can keep your view in place. This is just a great, great feature. More and more filmmakers are demanding it, and still photographers too, should be too. This camera's build quality is just excellent. I haven't tested it the way I have my Z cameras. It's a loaner and I don't want to destroy it, so I've been careful with it. But Not that I'm not careful with my own cameras, but I think those of you who follow the channel know that I've had some pretty rough experiences, and my Nikon Z cameras have proven extremely durable. I have no doubt this is built Canon tough in the traditional DSLR sense. It's a little bit bigger, beefier camera for a mirrorless camera. It feels a little bit like a mini 5D style camera. The controls are just really nicely laid out. I don't find myself accidentally bumping them as I'm holding them. Much like Nikon, the ergonomics are really, really good. There's a lot of nice programmable buttons. I'm going to be doing a whole video on how to set this camera up. I'm going to link that in this video's description. So if you go to the video's title or show more, you'll find a link. If you've got this camera or you're thinking about getting it, I've got a video that shows you just what I've learned over while using this camera, how I like setting it up, and some ways to customize it that I think makes it a little bit easier to use as a tool, particularly how to utilize the custom menus and some of the custom buttons, and what modes to set it up in, what some of the different menu minutiae mean. That's all going to be laid out. I think one of the things that Canon did that's really nice is they've got labels on the controls. So if you're going to move the upper wheel, it shows you that that's going to be shutter speed. There's a little image of that wheel. There's the wheel, or the dial. The back dial, it shows, is going to be ISO. And the wheel on the back, the traditional Canon wheel, is aperture. It shows you those with little symbols on the back of the camera. Really, really nice for someone like me who's not as Canon literate. It shows you digitally what each control is going to do, and you can customize those. There's also a really nice ring on this lens, and most of the RF lenses, that ring is exposure compensation, but you can program that to be whatever you want. The whole camera is very, very programmable, much like the Sonys and the Nikons. The image stabilization in this camera is fantastic. I've tested a little bit with Sony and with Nikon and with this, shooting at 200 millimeters handheld video, that really tests the image stabilization. So it's got, in-body image stabilization. This lens has more stabilization. Really incredible stuff. I'll show you some video handheld at 200 millimeters that'll probably boggle your mind. It's really, really good. I love the fact that the way they've set up the autofocus, a lot like Nikon and like Canon, the eye detect works really, really well. They've got animal, bird, human, and you can flip back and forth. You can also give it no preference, and it's just looking for eyes. And you go into its Q menu. There's a Q menu on the back, a quick menu, and it gives you all your sort of standard settings. Again, I'm going to show you these settings in a little separate video. I can't project this camera while I'm using it via HDMI. Sadly, it only goes out to the HDMI, but the Q menu is really, really nice. And if you go into the autofocus modes, I just think that their face and eye detect and auto tracking mode is the way to go. And it'll automatically, just like Nikon, determine what it is that you're photographing. That computational autofocus where it's seeing what you're tracking and making decisions, what's the closest thing that's probably the photographer's subject, or what's the thing that the photographer is moving with even if it's not the closest subject, and making determinations as to what it thinks you're photographing. And if you've got big frame filling action, it's going to do a great job nailing it. But if you want to override it, one thing that this does that you can't do with the Nikon, you can do it with the Sony, but not quite as beautifully. With this camera, you can actually just touch and set your autofocus tracking point automatically to, oh, that's the thing I want to be tracking, just by tapping in here while you're in that tracking mode. And you can program it so that only the bottom right corner sort of acts as a mouse pad. You can just run it all over the viewfinder just using this little bottom right corner, which is nice because you don't have to put your finger way out into the viewfinder. It just all is sort of located right here in the bottom right corner. You can put it wherever you want on the back LCD, but just by while you're shooting, if you drop your thumb in here and start moving it around, I can go all over my viewfinder. I wish I could show it to you. It works really, really well. Just by moving like that, I'm sending my autofocus tracking point all over inside the viewfinder. I like the fact that you can put a red, green, and blue live histogram up and see what's happening in each color channel live while you're looking at your scene. That's super cool. You can't do that with either Nikon or Canon or Sony. So bravo to Canon on that. I like the fact that you can have up to 7 custom configurations of your LCD in the back, from having no data whatsoever to having all the data in the world, including that red, green, and blue histogram. Same is true in the viewfinder. You have 3 different views that are completely customizable. It also, when you go vertical and you're looking through the viewfinder, it turns everything vertical. So you literally still have all your data, and it's not off looking at it from bottom to top. It moves it all so that it's being viewed, you can read it left to right, even though you're looking through the frame vertical. It changes the viewfinder to vertical. Just some really nice usability touches in here that are really well thought out. There's a few things that feel a little bit clunky, despite the fact that they're really, really cool. Like the fact that, like Nikon, now Canon's going to allow you to do just 2 frames of exposure compensation if you want, or of bracketing, so that you shoot one on the meter and one, 2, or 3 stops underexposed. You don't have to shoot the one that's overexposed if you don't need it. And I really, really like that, because I do that a lot for scenes with high contrast to blend these days. I just shoot one on the meter, 1 3 stops underexposed to make sure I have the highlights. I know I can pull the shadow detail with these amazing sensors. But at the same time, they've made it so that you have to activate the exposure bracketing in one menu item and tell it how many frames you want in another. It's like you set up how many stops apart they are in one menu, and you set how many frames it's going to be in another menu that aren't even close to each other. So that's important. In my setup guide, you can put those in your custom menu to make that really easy on yourself. I feel like Nikon's the only one who makes that really, really simple, where you can just program bracketing to a button, and the back wheel changes how many frames it is, and the front wheel changes how many stops apart they are. And it's like I don't even have to look up from the viewfinder. It's just push a button and click. But anyway, I digress a little bit. It is fantastic. It also does automated focus stacking like Nikon, where you can focus on the closest point in your scene, and then the camera will automatically just focus out at, from 1 to 10, these different size focus steps, depending on whether you're doing macro or landscape. You might want 9 for landscape and 1 for, 1-to-1 macro. And you can limit how many images it's going to take, so that if, for example, you're shooting some macro thing, you don't have to take 5,000 shots for it to go all the way out to infinity. You can say, I only want 100 images. You're going to throw that into your stacking software and come up with a razor sharp macro image. So that's something that Nikon does. Canon now does too. I really, really find that handy for doing both landscapes and macro work. I like the fact that it just has all the features that I would really, really want, and that I expect in a modern mirrorless camera, in a great form factor, easy layout. I really like the way that you navigate the menus, and the menus make sense to me the way that they're laid out. The controls are nice. It just feels good in your hand. And it takes 20 frames a second with almost no blackout whatsoever. It feels just a little bit stuttery compared to the Sony A1 or the Sony A9. Again, Sony's been doing this longer. Definitely better than Nikon with regard to blackout. And I've learned to live with the little bit of blackout that you have with the Nikon Z6 II or Z7 II shooting sports, action, and wildlife. I just frame it a little wider and anticipate the motion a little bit more. But I'm looking forward to the flagship camera coming from Nikon that promises not to have any lag, really, really designed in for sports and action and wildlife, and even better autofocus tracking. I find that with a close subject, tracking a close subject, I've been shooting, with the A1, with this R5, and with my Nikon Z7 II and Z6 II. I don't find it hard to track big frame filling motion. If I'm shooting sports, action, wildlife, and I've got the frame relatively filled with my subject, the autofocus is amazing. If the subject has an eye, it locks the eye. Sony obviously does a little bit better with some of the crazy wildlife, birds and other wildlife, but again, they've been doing it a little bit longer. With people, the eye detect autofocus is just amazing. This camera is no different. When you have a smaller subject that's really, really far away, you can't see its eyes, it's not moving around in the frame so well, I found that all three cameras often have a little bit of a hiccup or a problem. You know, small, erratically moving bird where you're gonna really need to crop to get a good image of it. It's tough. With any of the three cameras, you're gonna have frames that are missing. Speaking of image quality, let's just jump in. I'll talk a bit about image quality here and what I'm seeing with the R5. You know, one of the knocks on Canon for the last, almost decade, or maybe a decade now, has been that, Nikon and using Sony's sensors and Sony's backlit sensors have just had more dynamic range. So I was excited to test out, what is Canon getting with dynamic range in this R5. So here's a shot of my little girl Pepper in our garden with my wife watering. Real heavy backlit, high contrast scene, middle of the day. And if you look at how I'm able to get detail back both in the hose spray and her hair with just a little bit of Lightroom, all I'm doing is a little bit of basic develop settings in here, just a tiny bit of shadow and highlight, and just those basic exposure slider moves. Pretty cool stuff. Here's the setup of what I was out photographing. This one I've done a little bit of that exposure compensation too. There's limits. I feel as if the Nikons and the Sonys have a little bit more ability to recover highlight detail, to get more dynamic range, but the Canon's not bad. This is still eminently usable. There is detail lost here that I think with my Nikon at base ISO I would have been able to save, but certainly not any kind of a junker image. My kid's in the Clackamas River. This is a big high resolution sensor, just like the A1, just like the Z7 II. You get a lot of croppability. And this is a situation where, this is what I'm talking about. You're not really filling the frame. You're probably going to want to throw that tracking point up. You're going to, instead of just letting the auto area autofocus take over the tracking autofocus and face and eye detect, you're probably going to tap your thumb onto the LCD and move the tracking point over the dog's face. That's what I did here. It worked extremely well. And look at the croppability of this scene. It's pretty darn cool stuff. Eye detect's just amazing. You can be swimming around with your kids, even if a little bit of their hair and eyes are obscuring. It just nails. They're moving, I'm moving, we're out in the river. I don't have to worry about putting the autofocus point anywhere. It just sees eyes, and I can flick between eyes with the joystick, left, right, next person. Here's another situation where, because Pepper's a little closer to me and she's a human, the camera's going to choose her. But instead, I moved the tracking point over to Ollie, and when I did that, it automatically picks up Ollie's eye. Boom, there, and you can see, nailed my aunt's dog, Ollie. And just, nice, a beautiful detail and rendering. Great images out of this camera. No complaints there. Look at that. Yeah, Pepper's a cutie. So, anywho, even if your subject is wearing glasses, it's going to pick up the face. Here's my wife, Stacy, sitting by the river. You can hand the camera to someone else, like my wife, Stacy, and say, here's the autofocus button, here is the shutter, and bam. It didn't take her long to be getting nice, sharp images with it. Another just portrait of Ollie. Of course, taking it kiteboarding, I wanted to test how is it tracking. And as I said, with big frame-filling subjects, like my friend Cristiano here, who was a pro kiteboarder for years. Here he is unhooked. Or no, he's still hooked. But coming really in close toward me as I'm shooting. And that last frame in that sequence, still tracking his face. These cameras are all just amazing. A quick grab shot of him ripping by. This is his son, Alessandro, who's just getting amazingly good. A quick grab shot of him as he's launching his kite and heading out. And there's father and son. Look at that scene. It's recognizing that face is what's important to have in focus in this scene. Not getting confused by my good friend Jason doing a dark slide here, ripping his board across the water, making a giant amount of splash. It just it had no problem. Now that's not to say I don't have sequences where there's some missed shots with the Nikons, with the Sonys, with the Canons. Especially when action's this far out and away. This is the situation where you've got a smaller subject in the frame. You'd want to crop to get a good shot of it. and they're not moving that much in the frame because they're so far away, you know, you're going to want to put that subject tracking button by moving your thumb onto the LCD and setting it on my wife's face. It worked out really well. It tracks her right through this turn from heel to toe side on her foil. We've both gotten really addicted to hydrofoiling. You know, and here's one last example of Alessandro coming in. He's learning to ride a skimboard strapless with no fins or anything. It's just basically a, you know, a board, just like a kid would skim along the beach on. And you can see it kept him tracking really beautifully through that whole sequence. As he comes right up on me and I'm zooming back to keep him in the frame, no problem, locking in rock solid on him. You know, the other thing about this camera that's just amazing to me is the video capabilities. So this is 8K capable. You know, I don't have any need to shoot in 8K, but it has a mode where it shoots in 8K and then downsamples it to a higher quality 4K output, and you can do that in 8-bit or 10-bit. And what that means for those of you who don't shoot video, I'm not going to dwell on it too much. I'll talk a little bit about it in the setup and settings. You essentially can capture more dynamic range. It's a little like the difference between a JPEG and a RAW file. It's harder to work with in post-production. You have to apply a lookup table, a LUT, to that 10-bit video to make it look good. But I will say that shooting in 10-bit with this camera is a dream compared to doing it with my Nikons. It automatically looks good while you're shooting through the camera. It does a LUT, it applies a LUT to the footage while you're viewing it in the camera to make it look nice. And it records it right to the memory card, lickety split, no problem. It's a little tougher to work with in the aftermath. It's not something I would use all the time, but in high contrast scenes, let me show you the difference, what you can capture in video from one to the other. So here's my aunt out by the river and my little girl Pepper in 8-bit. All right, you can see those dark shadows and her hair is really, really blown out a bit there. Now look at it in 10-bit. Look at the amount of shadow detail. And these are processed the same in Adobe Premiere. I'll show that one more time. I'll show both those clips. Here we go. So there's the 8-bit, dark, dark shadows, bright, bright highlights. Here's the 10-bit. All that detail is saved. You know, here is some footage just showing how stable the image stabilization is. I'm shooting this at 200 millimeters with my friend Jim hydrofoiling. Jim Stringfellow, who's an amazing hydrofoiler. We're on the Columbia River here. And this is all just handheld at 200 millimeters. I think that gives you an idea just how rockin' the image stabilization is, that I'm standing out on a windy beach, hand-holding, standing up, not even braced. And then it shoots incredible 120 frame per second 4K slow motion. There's my friend Walker kiting. And this shot, this next shot, is one of my most proud captures as a videographer ever. This is Ollie ripping through the river in slow motion, and then watch the focus pull that the camera automatically does to come into Pepper because she becomes the closest subject, and then back to his face, and then back to Pepper, and then all right, so yeah, that just makes me happy. That footage makes me so happy. I don't think without the ability that this camera does with its automatic autofocusing and looking for faces and eyes and subjects that are of importance to me, I could have captured that slow motion sequence of Pepper and Ollie where focus pulls back to her, focus pulls back to Ollie, focus pulls back to her. It's just looking for the subject and smoothly moving in between. Really incredible stuff. And again, you know, the 8-bit video capability, or the 10-bit 8K downsampling to 4K that this thing does internally is pretty incredible. Now it has some overheating issues. You can't do that for really long sustained periods of time. That's one of the knocks on this. I'm hoping that Nikon Z9 comes out and does that same thing without overheating. Fingers crossed. I can't wait to check that out later this year. But for right now, this thing's pretty darn incredible. So is the Sony A1 with regard to its video capabilities. So some cool stuff, fun to play with. You know, the big, huge takeaway here, to my mind, is that if you're a Canon shooter who's been waiting to move to mirrorless, and you've got an investment in Canon and years of knowing Canon, this camera I can wholeheartedly endorse and say you're going to love. Along with, I don't know if you're looking at the images from this 70-200 f4, but those are pretty ripping amazing images out of an f4 piece of glass. This 70-200 f4 is something. So again, I'm not going to be really happy to send this back to B&H. But I love my Nikons and I'm not about to switch. I would say that right now, if someone snapped their fingers and I was forced to move to another brand, I probably would go Canon. I'm really enjoyed my time more than any other brand besides Nikon shooting with this. So that's the basic news of it. Again, I have a video on menu setup and customization for this camera. For those of you who have it or are considering it, or if you buy it, come back and look for it. It's in this video's description, along with links to buy this camera at B&H. Thanks so much to them for letting me use this for the last month. I've really enjoyed it. And if you use those links, it helps me out. They're affiliate links. I have links to all the gear that I regularly use and endorse at hudsonhenry.com/ATS links, both for Amazon and B&H, and direct links to manufacturers I work with. So thanks everybody. I hope again you'll sign up for office hours. That's going to be the 24th of August, 10 a.m. Pacific. We're talking about workshops. And I hope that, everybody's staying safe. We've got, some more craziness going on health-wise in the country, and I hope everyone is staying creative, staying safe, getting out there, taking images, and being able to have some community with other photographers. That's kind of what it's all about. So keep practicing, keep growing, keep taking images, and we'll see you next week.